Hi, everybody. We're going to start in just a minute, let a few more people log in. So give us about 1 or 2 more minutes. We'll get started. Okay, everybody, welcome to the webinar today. My name is Jen Hawes. I'm the Partnership Manager for Island Press, and I am pleased to bring you Design for Good, a conversation between Erin Barnes and John Cary. So it's a delight to bring together these two dynamic people who are both friends and esteemed colleagues in their fields to have this robust conversation today on design. Erin and John are going to be talking about how we can design our homes, buildings, and public spaces to be held accountable to diverse communities, respond to everyday needs, and even improve the quality of life. If you have a question during the webinar, please put them into the questions box on the webinar panel on your right. We will share questions with Erin and John at the end of the conversation. This webinar is brought to you today by Island Press and ioby. Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher. Founded in 1984, Island Press began with the simple idea, knowledge is power, the power to imagine a better future and find ways for getting us there. The mission of Island Press is to elevate voices of change, shine a spotlight on crucial issues, and focus attention on sustainable solutions like we're doing today. The webinar is also brought to you in part with the Urban Resilience Project, which is a part of the Island Press company. And the Urban Resilience Project has just released a new compilation. We just released it today, so it is free. We encourage you to check it out at islandpress.com/resilience-matters-giveaway. This compilation will shine a spotlight on the equity and sustainability articles that we've published in short form throughout the last year. So I'd like to introduce ioby. ioby, which stands for In Our Backyards, helps neighborhoods grow and implement great ideas one block at a time. The crowd resource platform at ioby connects leaders with funders, funding, resources, and support to make our neighborhoods safer, greener, more livable, and more fun. ioby believes that it should be easy to make meaningful change in our backyards, the positive opposite of NIMBY. ioby is committed to building the capacity of residents and to organize resources, financial, volunteer, and social from within their own neighborhood. If you have an idea for a project that you'd like to fundraise with ioby, then I encourage you to visit ioby.org/idea and submit your idea, and you can be connected with a staff member. So to begin the conversation, I'd like to introduce Erin Barnes. She's the co-founder and CEO of ioby. Erin completed her Master's of Environmental Management in Water Science, Economics, and Policy at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She was a U.S. Department of Education Foreign Language and Area Studies Scholar in Portuguese. In 2008, Erin joined the inaugural class of Obama Foundation Fellows in recognition of her contributions to creating a wave of civic innovation through her work at ioby. Erin serves on the board of EcoDistricts and Resource Media. And then I'd also like to introduce John Cary. He is an architect by training and has devoted his career to expanding the practice of design for the public good. John's first book, The Power of Pro Bono, along with his writing on design, philanthropy, and fatherhood, appeared in the New York Times, CNN, and numerous other publications. As John works as an advisor to an array of foundations and nonprofits around the world and frequently curates and hosts events for TED, the Aspen Institute, and other entities. Excuse me. Deeply apologies, committed to diversifying the public stage. He is a founding partner of Fresh, a next generation speakers bureau that represents young women and people of color. For 7 years, John served as the executive director of the nonprofit Public Architecture, building the largest pro bono design program in the world, pledging millions of dollars in donated services annually. In 2007, he published the book Design for Good with Island Press. I'll now hand it over to John to say a few words.
Hi, thanks so much. It's great to be here with you all. I'm excited to be in conversation with Erin Barnes, who I've gotten to know through her fellowship with the Obama Foundation, and I'm obviously honored to have been published by Island Press. It was a real joy to work with them. I'm a believer that authors write books that they need to read, and this was a book that in roughly 2015, when I started conceiving of it, there was a lot happening in both the world and in the design fields as it related to the pursuit of positive social impact work. And at the time, there was a long-standing organization called Architecture for Humanity that had recently closed its doors to a lot of dismay across the world because they were seen as this kind of beacon of hope in the design fields. And I received calls from journalists and other friends asking, is this the end of public interest design? And the interesting thing was, I think that was a legitimate question. But on the other hand, as I began to look around, I thought the work was actually stronger than ever. It was achieving greater scale, impacting people in ways that many of us in the early years of the last wave of this work could never even dreamed of. And so I decided to set about identifying projects across a range of project types. So those being education, health, housing, and civic projects. And then to do something that you don't often see the design media do in any real depth, and that was to interview both the clients and the users for ultimately narratives that would be positioned in this book to be on par with those of designers. So a lot of times when you get a design book, you read a lot about the designer's good intentions, and that's great. It's really important, but that's only half the story or less. And so I wanted to really showcase the human impact of architecture and design. And I really strongly believe that talking directly to users, or at least talking to clients, is the way to go about that. Now, of course, some project types, like hospitals in some respects, you can't get access to many of the most the most intended users, like patients. They're hopefully a transient community, but there are occasions where I was able to do that. I was also able to talk to doctors and nurses, for example, in healthcare settings. And then there are also, of course, very important stakeholders in the design and construction of any project, those being clients, those who are acting on behalf of the end users. And so those types of people are just really invaluable. And they're also valuable to design professionals because they are the kind of frontline ambassadors of our work. Oftentimes when we're, design professionals are flying around to schools and giving talks and serving on studio reviews and that kind of thing, we feel like we are the ambassadors for design, but in fact, it's end users who do that in both intentional and far more subtle ways. And so I think that they are kind of the unsung heroes of how design, is perpetuated throughout society, because they're the ones that, through word of mouth and the example and the experience of projects, really are the ambassadors for it. So I simply wanted to showcase that.
That's super interesting. John, I'm so excited to have this chance to talk with you today. As you know, ioby is focused on supporting people who are often stepping into civic life for the very first time. And we believe that residents know what's best for their neighborhoods. And because they have this unique bundle of information about the built environment and the social fabric that could enable change to happen and stewardship of that change over a long period of time. But when residents are designing solutions for these unique places, they often are coming from their own personal background. You know, they could be like nurses or teachers or parents or neighborhood association presidents, and more often than not, they're not design professionals. They're not professional planners or architects. But they still have influence over designing playgrounds and plazas and parks and libraries and other public spaces. And so I know that the attendees who are on this webinar are sort of a mix of people who come from design backgrounds and those who don't. And so I'm just kind of curious if you could sort of step back for a minute and talk to the folks who might be joining who have no background in design whatsoever, and just give us like the best example of the worst design for people that you've ever experienced, like or maybe the second best worst that you can think of, just so we can all share with you in your mind like what you're imagining when you think of like the opposite of what you're working towards.
Well, that's a great question. I I'm married to a journalist that Erin is also friends with, and she is well educated, but she firmly believes that she did not consider the impact of design in her own life, even, much less the people that she's writing about, until I came into her life. And I think that may be the case for some people, but I believe that we are all instinctively, and even often cases unconsciously, affected by the world around us. It can make us feel calm or agitated or unseen. It can do all sorts of things. And so one of my dream jobs is to be the head of the US Postal Service, because I firmly believe that post offices, as well as DMVs and other public buildings and environments like that, really are consistently bad for every class of society. Every single person has to endure the kind of mind-numbing like weights and often, increasingly I should say, uninspiring environments. When I was growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the downtown post office was this enormous like vaulted space with just such a kind of like energy and reverence to it. It was like the kind of the intersection of the city in so many ways. In fact, there was this beautiful architectural model of the city of Milwaukee in the post office. I loved going there as a kid. And now you just go into these places where there's it's like fluorescent lights, no windows, all these tellers behind bulletproof glass. They look miserable and overworked and everything else. And so I think a lot about those types of experiences that impact all of us. And most people will be like, well, I don't expect to have good design in a space like that, but why not? That's what I'm trying to ask, is like, shouldn't every space that we inhabit be well designed in order for all of us, rich and poor, to live our best lives?
Yeah, I can't wait for you to be the head of the U.S. Postal Service. That's going to be great for everybody. So, like the other side of the coin, maybe you could talk a little bit about. I had a chance to read some of your book, and there's incredible examples throughout it. I wonder if maybe you can just share with all of us, like one or maybe two, if it's really compelling, of your favorite examples of like the very, very best design spaces for people, either from the book or another.
Yeah, the project that I think everyone is looking at on their screen is an aerial view of a hospital in rural Rwanda that was conceived by Partners in Health, which is this pioneering global health organization that was initiated in Haiti, continues to work there extensively, and now is in over a dozen countries with dozens more, employing its model. And so when Dr. Paul Farmer, who's the head of one of the co-founders and the kind of most publicly known head of Partners in Health, was giving a talk at Harvard years ago, he talked about designing everything from hospitals and clinics to health worker schools and even roads. And there was an architecture student named Michael Murphy who was just happened to be at this lab that students, rarely leave the design schools to go and pursue, but he was already over that hump. And he approached Dr. Farmer at the end of the talk, and Dr. Farmer said, he was happy to meet him, et cetera. And then Michael, this architecture student, said, I want to work for the firms that you, Partners in Health, employ to do these things like hospitals and clinics. And Dr. Paul Farmer famously said, well, I've never worked with an architect or a design professional. And so here was a leading public health, global health pioneer and practitioner who's never benefited from the services of good design. Now, he still had facilities, and those were almost assuredly better than what had been there before, but they hadn't seen the role and the significance of design be applied to the types of places that they are working in. Now, that might be how a normal project transpires, except that Partners in Health had a mandate for all of its contractors. When they were building a place, they wanted the local community to both be engaged with the design and construction of it, and they wanted to use local materials. And so those became the kind of hallmarks of Mass Design Group's work. Mass Design Group is one of the most prominent design firms in the world at this point. Over 100 staff. They have projects on, in dozens of countries, and yet the kind of root of the local labor and local materials that are hallmarks of their work come from a completely different sector, and come from a sector, public health, that is expressly focused on community needs and the public good. And so the Butara Hospital is one of those. And then, other ones, I made a very strong, a concerted effort to show that there can and there are lots of projects here in the United States. It's easy to, as bizarre and ironic as it sounds, to romanticize projects in Africa or some other so-called developing country. But I wanted to also show projects that can have the same values, achieve the same goals here in the United States. And so you can see housing examples of that in Dallas, as well as right in my hometown of Oakland. You can see a bunch of other examples, but I'll stop there.
That's awesome. I think it's so interesting, even the way of framing the space as a facility versus like a place is just like a completely different orientation towards like architecture, right? That's super interesting. I want to go back a little bit to the idea of civic spaces, since you were talking about like post offices and DMVs and other places where we wait in line as part of like being Americans. And I was thinking about you and I were in the same session about the Obama Presidential Center back in November. And we were listening to the designers talk about designing the center for the purposes of like democracy and to create a civic space and to like be a really engaging place. And I was just kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about like, so if there's great design, like this example of this hospital or other places, how do you like apply those same principles when you're thinking about creating a space for like civic activity and for people to interact? Like, what are some of the like best public spaces that you think do that?
Well, honestly, many of the public spaces that I think of at the moment are ones that come with great compromise, at least here in the U.S., that have, very sometimes subtle, at other times more like very overt attempts to make sure that people can't sleep on a bench, for example, or and that's why they divide up the bench into these little smaller seats. That that just send certain people signals that they're not welcome here, even though it may be in fact, a publicly funded, a publicly maintained space. I think that probably varies for folks. Many of whom are watching today are from the U.S., but you can see examples of that in cities like the ones that I live in, one I live in, or in more rural communities where folks don't feel welcome. I'll give a personal example. We every weekend, all these like neighborhood parents, whether or not they send their children there, end up at the same public school playground. Like we have a place that our kids enjoy, that is welcoming, that is central, that has, in this case, just like the most simple like astroturf berm that the kids run up and down, the parents just like kind of lounge on as everyone's running around, and that to me is a great example that you don't need like huge interventions of design to create a place that can be used by a community. It can be very subtle, very low cost, and yet better than nothing at all. I mean, meaning that like if the playground was just an asphalt, lot in the way that a lot of public school playgrounds are, that would be one thing. But we go there because of this like this slightly more intimate experience.
I was thinking about the same aspect of like how places make you feel like you're welcome or whether you belong. And I think that like, right, design and architecture isn't like special in that it's another way that like white culture tells communities of color that they're not welcome there, right? And I think that is a really good example that you were talking about. And then I was also thinking that like the no loitering signs is like one of the clearest like signals that I feel like I see in a lot of spaces. That's like, it's just a really clear message. Like, you don't belong here, please leave, right?
Yeah.
And
they're not talking about me.
right, exactly. And I think that like there's a lot of work to be done to change the way that we design spaces for people. And I'm really curious to learn more. There's a collective called Black Space that's specifically created to change engagement in design and planning practices to affirm Black people and Black culture and the importance of Black spaces. And I'm just kind of curious if there's other organizations or groups like that, or like approaches that you think are part of the design and architecture field that we should be paying attention to that are changing that dynamic?
Well, I think Black Space is a perfect example. I don't want to. I have to acknowledge some of the efforts of the APA and that's the American Planning Association, the ASLA, American Society of Landscape Architects, as well as the AIA, American Institute of Architects. They are doing work at all levels that are trying to do some of this. Unfortunately, most of those organizations are reflective of the structural barriers to entry in the field and are thus predominantly white male, at least in the case of architecture. And so there's some challenges with that, and that's why I can't completely defer to them, and that's why things like Black Space exist. And yet there are other groups that, one that comes to mind is ADPSR. We don't have enough acronyms out there. That's Architects, Designers, Planners for Social Responsibility. That's been around for decades, and that is, unlike those other trade organizations or membership organizations, it is at least interdisciplinary, meaning it has these various design fields that we all know go into making any public space, not just one of them. And they've taken they've taken on different issues over the years. The most current one that they're focused on is trying to end the design of the places of mass incarceration. And so that's like not a community space in the normal sense that we would talk about, but I just want to acknowledge that as well. But Black Space, I think, is a prime example of a group that is trying to facilitate a more communal, equitable, and participatory process.
Yeah. I was thinking, I spend like a lot of time like kind of like near architects and planners. I'm not either one myself, but I feel like a lot of ioby projects are sort of like architect design adjacent. And then one thing I've noticed is that like all of the architects that I talk to all seem to be really obsessed with sci-fi. Like they're like into futurism or something like this. And I don't know, I was just kind of wondering if you could shed a little light on what that's about. And I see that there's sort of a parallel in this, like around some of the work of like Afrofuturism and ethical imagination around like designing a world that we can't see right now, that only exists in our imagination. I don't know if that's something that you've noticed as well.
Yeah, I think, well, there's always been, I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, others have made attempts to design utopia in their minds. And whether or not that qualifies as sci-fi is another question. But I do a lot of work these days with both the family and the kind of legacy of Charles and Ray Eames. And just yesterday, I was with an Eames historian in a library, and he basically showed, Charles Eames' favorite books were science fiction. So it's not a new thing like today. I've referenced these three historical people, all of which are men. I'll acknowledge, just to point out that there's been that kind of like instinct for a long time. I'll tell you one other like much more like practical kind of risk of the kind of science fiction conceptual design fascination that people have, and that's that as design professionals, many of us have pursued design competitions and kind of thrown ourselves at conceptual projects as a way to, of course, exercise our creative muscles, but we do so in the face of so much other need in society, so many other places that you don't have to pretend that there's a need there. There's a need so clear and present in front of us, and yet these design competitions are like wildly popular. And they're popular in the press because they often generate images that people get excited to see. But I think that design competitions are one of the Achilles heels of the design profession. I think they perpetuate a lot of the problems, both internally and externally, from a perception standpoint about what design is.
That's super interesting. I never thought about it that way. So if you're saying basically that like designers are trained to be able to like come up with conceptual models, and they're like trained to activate creative muscles, but in the context of like an imaginary situation entirely, like decontextualized from real problems that are in your face today. I wonder if you can sort of like share what some of those practices are with like a layperson who might be like leading an IOB project in their community, and they have a specific project that they know all of the context, they know all of the limitations of their community, they are trying to get the best thing done with the least amount of effort possible. So how would you share with people who aren't professional designers how to activate their imagination and like engage with other community members to go through some like really, really light and easy ways of designing spaces for the public?
Well, I think that the type of expertise that you just identified is exactly the type of expertise that the kind of relatively newly named approach of human-centered design tries to foreground. Now, when you talk about human-centered design, it raises the question that if design historically hasn't been centered around humans, what has it been centered around? That's a story. That's the kind of a debate for another time. But this idea of centering the design work around the needs, the experiences, the expertise, the insights of the users is definitely, I think, real progress. I also think of human-centered design because there is a course, an online course that IDEO.org and Acumen, which is a social impact investing organization, have pioneered together, through which upwards of 100,000 people who are not trained in design have learned to use the principles of human-centered design for everything from community organizing to neighborhood planning. And so I think that there are some real, like, if you want the real tools and the process and some case studies about how to be a lay person and approach design, that's the organization that I would point people to.
That's awesome. Sort of on the same lines, I wonder. I don't want to sort of like conflate two things that aren't the same thing, but I feel like what you're saying is that there's this context about the people who are going to use spaces, the end users, or the context of the place that's sometimes absent from like more traditional design, and that there's like new things like human-centered design that's moving away from that and evolving the field a little. And I'm kind of curious how you see this in relationship to the important and evolving discussion around like placemaking, which now has like also gotten bigger, and we're talking about like place keeping and place revealing and raskification and like all the different ways of our relationship to place. I'm just kind of curious if there's like elements of place focused or place centered design that are somehow different from human centered design, or if it's really all about the same simple parts.
I think that's a great question. I am loosely familiar with some of those terms. I'm more familiar with terms like creative placemaking that kind of are a little bit more of a merger, at least a more explicit merger between design and place. And I think that all of those efforts, both to title it something and to propagate an approach to them, can be really useful. They can also be risky in the sense that when you talk about creative placemaking, it can give people a sense that there wasn't a place there before, or that there wasn't a community there before. And I think that you can run the risk with any time you try to label something. You can kind of get to that point. I would also just emphasize that no one of these approaches and no one of these groups, like architects, designers, planners, or even citizens on their own, can do as much or as well as these different groups coming together and working like truly collaboratively can do. There was a push years ago for what folks called citizen designers. That designers would do all of these things. Now imagine if somebody went and said, well, there should be citizen doctors, there should be citizen, nurses instead of, in lieu of going to the hospital. Because of course there's people that do provide some type of healthcare in different settings, but like we do still have trained experts for a reason. In the case of the built environment, that's for the purposes of health, safety, and welfare of the public. And so I strongly believe that it's the bringing of bringing people together that is the key, as opposed to trying to rely on any one of these silos.
That's super helpful. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk more about like your perspective from a more personal level. So I recently found out that you're a runner, and you spend a lot of time running around different neighborhoods, I assume. And so I'm just kind of curious what you learn about places as you're running. Do you ever specifically go out to like find out about something new while you're running around, or is it just exercise and no place-based learning for you?
I do run a lot, or I used to run a ton. Now I run less than I would like. But everywhere I go is like anytime I run, I'm able to just like take things in so much more. And I become very familiar with places. I become, certainly when I have routine, routes around here, around where I live, I become familiar with people as well, meaning like pass the same people at the same time, at the same on the same type of day. And so yeah, I think you can tell so much about a city by uh, the way that it's, forget runners, but just like pedestrians generally are treated. And I gave a commencement address a few years ago that recounts the the place where I spent the majority of my childhood, which was suburban Milwaukee. And now Milwaukee has all sorts of great virtues and all sorts of really significant complications. It remains one of the most segregated cities in the country. But where I was living, largely because I was from a very large family and we had to kind of move outside the city, as opposed to other reasons you might go to suburbia, there were no sidewalks. And so I distinctly remember, like watching people, young and old, like walking on these busy streets with like no sidewalks. And I was just like astounded at that time that even in my youth, I could tell the difference between a place that was designed for people and a place that was, in that case, designed really just for cars or for people to pass through. And so, anyway, that's what comes to mind when you ask that question.
Yeah, I've noticed that I spend a lot of time in Memphis, Tennessee, which a lot of people know. And, it's really obvious that some neighborhoods get things like sidewalks, and other neighborhoods that tend to be poorer and tend to be communities that are mostly of color are like the ones that don't have sidewalks. And it's really, really interesting to watch the way that people sort of navigate around places when they're like obviously not designed for people to live there, and how crummy that can be. It's also interesting to see what people do to try to bring attention to the fact that those things are missing. I know that there's like one tactical urbanism tactic that's to like spray paint in bright colors the weeds that are growing that would be where a sidewalk could be, just to bring attention to it. Other things like that.
I love those. I love those kind of guerrilla tactics. One of the projects that I think a lot about to this day was done by, oh gosh, the name's just escaping me. It was a kind of guerrilla effort by some employees of an architecture firm in Los Angeles called Marmol Ratzinger. And I want to say it was like, oh gosh, it's escaping me. But they literally built a staircase over a wrought iron fence. There was a fence that had like closed off a public park, so nobody could access it. And so they literally built this like beautifully designed staircase up and over it, and it was just like such a simple thing. And anyway, that's just like an image that comes to my mind.
We have a couple questions coming in from our listeners to the webinar right now. So I want to ask a few of these as they're coming in, and encourage anybody else who's listening to please go ahead and share your questions in the chat box. One of the questions, John, is just to talk a little bit about best practices on getting youth involved in the design process. I'm not sure if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, I think that first, I have two children, a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I know the kind of learning that they get from really anything that I'm willing to involve them in. Also, the sense that they feel like they're a part of something, and then finally, one of my daughters literally pressed the button for our gas grill yesterday, and she for the rest of dinner talked about making dinner for everyone. And so you can give people with even small gestures of young people, small gestures of being a part of something. They take an ownership of it, and it can be really meaningful to them. I think that there are different phases where youth involvement makes a great deal of sense. In the kind of early phases of kind of coming up with ideas, of identifying needs, and them asking the most fundamental questions that we sometimes as adults don't even think to ask ourselves. I think that that's a really amazing moment for them to be involved in. And then I know that that there in a couple of cases with some of the school design projects in the book, there were more direct, kind of what we call charrette efforts, where there would be a chance for children to have some kind of design challenge that could draw out the insights from them. And now, whether or not those translate directly into something that's built is another question. It would probably, I think, very realistically be more, how could it influence those things, and how could it inspire people? I think you'd find that a design team or whomever the stakeholders are would often refer back to the kind of one or more of the youth examples or that gathering and that kind of thing. And I think it can just add just so much energy to these projects. But I'm also a realist. These, so the types of projects, at least that are in my book, and some of the other projects, not every moment of it will be suitable for youth. And so I don't claim to for that to be the case. One example of an organization that I think does this work, well, two examples. One of them is based in Philadelphia, called Public Workshop, and they do really amazing work that is directly with youth. They would probably be on the kind of end of pushing even my comfort zone of what youth are capable of doing, but they have extraordinary results that you can see by going to their website. And another group out here on the West Coast is Project H Design, which does more of the training in the different craft aspects of design and construction specifically for youth, and in fact focus mostly on young girls. And I think that both of those are really fantastic examples of creating a structure for it, figuring out how to optimize that, and then applying that to different settings, as opposed to just having a project, often cases for a community or a client that's not familiar with construction or design or community based planning, and then having youth involved that way. I think that those are other channels, basically.
So the two organizations you mentioned that have really great examples of best practices for this, you said Public Workshop in Philadelphia and Project H Design in California. And I'll add to the list, I think, also Hester Street Collaborative based in New York. I remember we worked with them. They fundraised for a project on ioby a long time ago in Sarah D. Roosevelt Park. and it was a youth engagement process for kids to be able to design different parts of the park. And I remember it was pretty limited because obviously the Parks Department does most of the capital projects there. But I remember talking to the staff at Hester Street about the project, and they said that even though they're, a design firm that's a spinoff from an architecture firm, the purpose in doing that project actually had nothing to do with the design at all. It was actually to teach kids that they had agency and that they could experience, like at some point very young in their lives, like, oh, I can actually build this, and like I can create things in public spaces that like other people in the city will see. Like I have the ability to do this. So then they can carry that with them and know that they have that kind of agency going forward.
I love that. And Hester Street's such a fantastic example.
Yeah. And then another participant wanted to just repeat the organization that provides design principles to lay people. And I think you said it was a combination of IDEO and Acumen. Is that right?
With IDEO.org, which is the nonprofit spinoff of the design and strategy firm known as IDEO, they partner with Acumen, which is a social impact investing organization, and it's a program called Plus Acumen. It should be pretty easy to find. It's a human-centered design course would probably pull it up.
Great. And then another participant wants to know if we can speak a little bit about important elements that should be considered in the design of smaller outdoor public spaces like pocket parks. If there's anything specific to that you know about, John.
Yeah, I think it's just the short version that I think about relative to pocket parks and parklets and all sorts of other things are just to see potential in underutilized spaces, to see the possibility of new life or the ability of people to come together, there are a lot of examples of those. Certainly from like the parklets were a big rage for a long time, and I was involved with the design of literally one of the very first parklets back in San Francisco in the early 2000s. I think that the beauty now of the internet is that we can see all these examples and we can draw inspiration from them. And so I'm not sure if that fully answers their question, but I hope so.
I wonder, one of the things that I've noticed a lot of is like that oftentimes small public spaces are sort of designed with like one type of user in mind. A friend of mine refers to this as public spaces for polite sandwich eating, where like really like that's the only thing that you can do. You can just politely and silently eat a sandwich there, and like if you do anything else, it's going to obviously disrupt what the space is designed for. And so I'm kind of thinking about like, is what you're suggesting like more of like the project for public spaces power of 10 idea, like have spaces designed with like a lot of different uses in mind, so that there can be a lot of different interaction of people in that space, or is it something?
Those are the kind of spaces that we want to be in, right? I mean, of course, there's room for quieter spaces, but you look at where is a community at its best. I think that's a place where young and old, rich and poor can coexist, and not just like coexist quietly eating sandwiches, but like literally, interact with one another, or at least acknowledge or be seen by one another. And I'm trying to find an example of what a project like that is. I haven't been in one of those very much recently, honestly.
There's one not too far from my office, that's off of Prospect Park, on the east side, in near like the Flatbush neighborhood. And I'm pretty sure that the name of the park or the plaza is called Parkside Plaza. And it's a project that I think has had some support from the organization, the Neighborhood Plaza Project, that Laura Hansen has done some work on in New York. And it's near transit, and so part of the park, part of the plaza is about just being like the space from going from the subway station or the bus stop into the park. Part of it is about like resting and relaxing. There is places to eat sandwiches politely or impolitely there. It's also sort of like a meeting spot because it's near a bunch of other places that people would go to. So it's like it's a good spot to say like, oh, I'll meet you there. And then it has like some design elements that I think are meant to make it like a little bit more relaxing, like as almost as if it's an extension of Prospect Park into the neighborhood a little bit. And I know that there was some really great architects and designers involved in that, whose names I don't know off the top of my head right now, but I can share that background later after this is over.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
Let me see. If there's other questions, oh, there is one here from a friend of mine. So a friend of mine is curious, what is the responsibility of the design profession and planning profession to provide public spaces that accommodate the homeless, as an example, which one could argue is different from being welcoming, versus providing the services to support community members in need, like, for example, the homeless and others? Are all social spaces unwelcoming if they are not designed to support homeless activity? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's probably above my pay grade, but it's I think it's the most, it's like the crucial question here, and I think it is the core responsibility of designers and planning professionals who are entrusted, and in the case of architects, granted with a monopoly to to uphold the health, safety, and welfare of the public. But if we only do that for clients that can afford our services, then we're not actually doing that for the public. And so the homeless piece comes in because these are some of the most vulnerable people. They will never be able to, at least while they're experiencing homelessness, they cannot on their own access these services, and so that's why the kind of service model of at least the vast majority of architecture firms and architects that I'm familiar with don't have much room for this type of this demographic of society that in fact may need services and may need shelter, just like the fundamental need of shelter, more than anyone. And so it's like one of the core responsibilities, and it's one that very few design professionals and planners are meeting. Now, it's a little more nuanced to get into like the use of certain spaces, but I think you can go back to some of the things I said about at the very beginning of our conversation about the benches that are divided up so people can't do anything more than sit awkwardly on them, or the loitering signs that you mentioned, Erin, and those are direct signals to homeless people in particular that they are not welcome, and so that is something that all those things happen by choice, meaning there can be alternatives to either one of those, the very common but also the egregious signals to these communities that certain people are not welcome there. Those things can be rethought. They can be there can be some other approaches beyond just relying on those very old and oftentimes very ineffective tools.
That's great. Jason Hercules, thank you so much for asking that question. I think it's so important. Also, I wanted to share, another participant has shared that ULI has a school kids program on design, and you can find out more about that at toronto.uli.org. And the name of the article is called "When I Grow Up, I Can Be a City Builder," which is great. We've got time for like one question maybe, and in case anybody's still writing theirs, you can do it right now. There is one sitting here that is asking about examples of design that employ reused materials and sustainable guidelines to sort of incorporate waste. I wonder if there's some best practices or some organizations or guidelines that you can point us to, John.
Yeah, there's the organization that I worked with and led for 7 years called Public Architecture has a reuse primer that is all about the employing materials in the construction of projects. So I would point you to that. Liz Ogbu is the primary author of that, and she's an extraordinary advocate for design and one of the like foremost and vocal and compelling advocates for community engaged design. So I would point you to that. I would also just try to broaden it a little bit and encourage people to take a step from what our current expectation is that things just get built, but another step, even if some of the complications around reused materials are complicated, just make one step in the interim toward local materials, sourcing all materials from within a meaningful and a small radius of where a project is happening. That would be a major feat in and of itself. And then, I can say also just from experience, I was involved in 2005 with a project called Scrap House, where we designed and built an entire house out of garbage in front of San Francisco City Hall for World Environment Day. That those projects can just pique the public's imagination in ways that very few new buildings ever can or do. And so there is also like a public interest in terms of like the actual interest of the public that I think should not be underestimated with projects like that.
Yeah. I'm also thinking, I actually haven't interacted with this group in a really long time. I think that the organization still exists though. I knew it from when I lived in Oregon. City Repair, I think, does some bus stop benches and things like that made of sustainable materials.
Cool.
So maybe like one last question here. Somebody's asked for advice for small nonprofits addressing mobility issues in low-income communities. So where there's a lot of those things that we've touched on so far, like no sidewalks, no stairs, not a lot of like transit. What are some ways to think about mobility differently? I'll just share really quickly that ioby's been able to support a couple organizations that specifically provide bicycles, like bike gear and like bike training, bike commute training to new immigrant groups living in a community where there's like basically the entire city is designed for cars, and it's really hard for people to get around, especially if it's a car dependent economy. And that's been pretty successful. We supported a project in California that does that, and another one here in Ohio. But I wonder if there's other things too, John, that you're thinking of that a small local nonprofit can do to address mobility issues.
Well, I would just suggest, partnering as much as possible with groups that have some expertise on it, rather than feeling the need or even like getting creative on your own terms to do that. I think that the beyond the accessibility movement, the kind of universal design guidelines that are available both federally and assuredly you can apply some of that locally. There are groups. There's a group called like Freedom by Design that does more like really basic handicap ramps and that kind of thing, and those in fact are often built by students, etc. But I think no other, nothing immediately is coming on to the top of my head. So I do appreciate folks raising that question though. And you know, Erin, I am just like such an admirer of the platform that you and ioby have built. I love the stories. This would be like a maybe even a more interesting webinar for me to like interview you, which about just the work that that you see your community members doing. That's the type of work that is going to like carry society forward. These examples in my book, I think, are useful and they can inspire people, but they remain the exception. And so the more that we can kind of raise people's expectations that they deserve good design, it will help. It will build demand for this type of work. It will create new markets for this type of work. But really, in the interim, and I think even for the long haul, the type of you know, citizen-led projects that you have created a place for and a community for, you know, those are the ones that will get us through.
Well, that's awfully nice of you to say, John. I think we should just close on that note then. I'm joking. Hey, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and your experience with us, and for pointing everybody into all these directions to find out more information. And I think that that's it. We'll wrap up. I hope everybody enjoyed their lunch with us. And thanks very much to Island Press for putting this together.
Thank you all.